Oh, there it is. Okay.
There you are.
Okay. There we go. Good stuff.
Well, thank you all for coming to the last of our 2026 education series webinars or seminars or whatever these are, the program. So tonight we welcome Bob Worrall from Burlington, Ontario. I'm sure everyone knows of Bob Worrall. He needs no introduction anymore. But so, Bob, we'll just thank you for doing this and take it away.
Thanks, Jim, and thank you for putting these on. It's absolutely terrific, and looking forward over the course of the next hour and a bit to maybe giving you each one or two clues that you can walk away with. I wanted to focus tonight on technical issues and use rhythm along with that, and they kind of interplay with each other. To address some of these technical issues that we as pipers all have. I know in previous sessions I've focused a lot on like musical things and question and answer phrasing and everything. So tonight I wanted to deal primarily with technical issues and maybe some solutions. And a lot of this, it's an evolving thing because I do a lot of teaching, and every few weeks, I encounter an issue that a player is having, and I have to help them find a solution. And what works for one player does not necessarily work for all. And had a player at the house here today, and one of the big issues was elevation, finger elevation. And I want to talk about that tonight. And people have issues with their technique because in the case of embellishments, they're not locking into the rhythm of the embellishment, a tourlouth or a grip or a doubling. All of those movements, or if you're into pibroch, Cronlouth movement, there's music in the embellishment, and the music is based on rhythm, and we have to find that. We have to be able to execute that. And that's where people fall down a great deal. And there's an adult player that I'm working with. He'd never studied pibroch before, and he said, I want to study pibroch. I go to all the contests. I sit and I listen. I don't want to compete with it. And he plays in a street band. They don't compete. They do a lot of teaching. And so I took him on as a pupil, and we've had a really great time. When we hit new movements, like a dray or an adre movement, and I was starting from scratch with him, it was really good, really good. But then we hit a tourlouth variation, and you could well imagine the tourlouth was, how should we say it, random. It was just a random movement. So, what we want to hear in Scotland the Brave is da-ba-da, 1, 2, 3. And what was I hearing from him? So, well, he's just stabbing at the chanter with his pinky. There's some grace notes flailing around, but I'm not hearing the definition of the movement. So we had to start from scratch with a movement that he'd been playing for decades. He's got a great tourlouth now, an absolutely great tourlouth. When I explained to him that the rhythm of the movement, the tourlouth translated from the cantric means 3, da-da-da, 1, 2, 3. And when I explained that to him, you could see the light kind of flickering and coming on. I said, okay, wouldn't it be great if it were written GDE, GDE, and then follow it with ah. So when we did that, I said, do 3 of them in a row and then give me a tourlouth and make it rhythmically sound the same. Threw the chanter down. He said, I've never played a tourlouth like that in my life. And I said, you've just played your first really good tourlouth. And for the pibroch players tuning in tonight, you know that some tourlouth variations are not written with standard tourlouths. They're actually written with GDEs. And so it means 3. And so I gave him and this is terminology I came up with years ago, a rhythmic reference point. A rhythmic reference point that allowed him to take something that he's good with, GDE, and then take it and play it side by side with something that he's having trouble with. So get the one he's having trouble with to mimic the one that he's good with. Now I use that strategy all the time now, absolutely all the time. For Pibroch players in the group tonight, when you encountered your first, the Dre movement, the E and F grace note up to E, or from whatever note. And because we're so used to G's and D's, or G's and F's, we're not used to E and F. Now, just think about it for a second. I just want to play around with your brain a little bit on this. The first doubling you learned was a G and a D. Top, down, top, down, top, down. And then you got to D. You couldn't make a D grace note, so it's still top. And the nearest grace note to the D, the E, top, down. E grace note, or E doubling rather, top, down. F1, another G grace note, so 2 G's. But all of a sudden, the Dre movement is the bottom grace note, the E, and then the F. And for people playing Dre movements and they've never played one before, they have trouble. That's a stop. It's a doubling. So many of our embellishments are based on doublings. Like even the Turluith is a doubling on low G off to a theme note, the next note, with an E grace note. Doubling off, doubling off. Anyway, so someone I'm teaching the Dre movement to right off the bat, I give them a rhythmic reference point. I said, look, if you were doing, let's say from C up to E, but instead of the Dre movement, let's say it's a low A doubling, which is a G and a D. So I get them to do a number of GDs, GDs from C, GD, and then EF, and get the EF to mimic the GD. So the GD, the EF, sounds the same, just tonally a bit different because you've got different grace notes. And then that's a doubling, GD up. I call that a cheater. And there's the real deal with an E and an F. When you use a strategy like that, it builds confidence, what they can do, and then what they're having trouble mimicking it, they use the rhythmic reference point of the doubling and then have the Dre movement mimic it. And it's magic how it works. And it's really interesting, some really, really skilled players, without mentioning names, I mean some of the big names who are doing a lot of teaching. And, we exchange a lot of ideas. And when I mention this one, the rhythmic reference point, and they'll say, oh God, yeah, people, they just seize up on the Dre movement. I said, well, here's what I do. And you mention this, and you see the light go, that's a great idea. An absolutely great idea. So little strategies like that really, truly work. The student that I first used that with, and it's our movement in Pibroch once again, so for the non-Pibroch folk, just bear with me on this. We have a movement that goes to our Pibroch high G. So it's an EF. So in other words, it's the Dre combination EF grace note up to high G. And you'll hear people just seize up on that low G and miss the movement. Or it's not, the music is totally distorted rhythmically because they may get it, but it's not placed where it needs to be placed. So a student of mine, strong fingers, playing in the grade 1 amateur, and time for a new tune. I said, you're ready for one of the classics. McDougall's Gathering. How does it go? Played to the first line. Got to the end of the first line, and it has that movement. She said, oh, stop. I can't play that movement. I said, what? She'd been playing for some time. So that was a red flag for me. I said, okay. Well, it's an E and F and up. I said, wouldn't it be great if it were a GD up? She said, oh, yeah. But I'd never get away with that, would I? I said, no, it's incorrect. But GD, GD, EF, EF, and get comfortable, and then. So I did them back and forth, and then had her to do the real deal. Threw her chanter down. She said, I've never played one that good in my life. How'd you get me to do that? I said, I gave you a rhythmic reference point. That was the first time I used that strategy. Fast forward, I started using it a little more with different movements. And I was teaching in Ohio at the school in the summertime, and we finished our program later on the afternoon, and I was going to meet up with some of the Highland dancing judges because they're a lot of fun. And we were going to have some glasses of Perrier or something at the end of a long day. So I went over to the gym where they were working on they had an extra choreography class. And one of the dancers in the group was having trouble articulating something that was supposed to be on the left foot. Certain rhythmic thing that had to happen on the left foot. And this one girl was having a lot of trouble with it. And the instructor said, do it on your right foot. So I'm watching this. And she said, but I won't be with the rest of the group when we do the choreography. She said, I know, but just do it on your right foot right now. So put the music back on, did it with the right foot, do it again, right foot, do it again, right foot. She said, now do it with the right foot, then do it with the left foot. Right foot, left foot. Nailed it. I went. She gave her a rhythmic reference point. She took where she was comfortable, and then where she was not comfortable, got to mimic it. And I'm sure, because I know we have some drummers with us tonight, that there's a similar strategy that you can use there, and probably do use it. But when you see that, you say, can I expand that strategy and use it to help solve lots of other issues? I have on my own list here the grips, people jamming the grip and not getting da-da-da, and it goes, and they don't get the separation of the two low Gs. One of the things I wanted to talk about tonight was focus on the fingers defining the short note. Now, in a grip, there's a short low G into another low G and then off. And what happens when people jam it, the first low G isn't sounded enough and the D grace note comes in too soon. And then you watch the player's hands and you see the fingers barely touching for the low G. I said, look, you need to feel that low G. Feel it. And I want to see that pinky in particular on the chanter, separating those two low Gs, bum, bum. And then sometimes we go to the starting point, or don't do the whole grip to E, just C, G, G, C, G, G. And then go to the end point. Do the start and then go to the end point. So sometimes when you isolate things like that, rather than try to do the whole package, maybe it's go to the end point of a movement, an embellishment, and then layer the front end in. But if the problem's at the front end, just isolate the front end of the movement and then put the package together. So breaking things down like that. I know with some of you, I've worked with this before. I know at Winter Storm, I was doing a session on this, and I said sometimes words on something can really help. And I mentioned the Crunluath movement because some of you who are not pibroch players are saying, oh, well, I'll never play one of those because I don't play pibroch. I said, well, stop. We are now seeing more pibroch movements into light music compositions. I've seen the odd hornpipe written these days that has a Crunluath movement in it. So how do you play it? And this one adult I was telling you about where we sorted out his Turluath, and then it came time for the Crunluath, and he struggled with that movement. And I had used all of my strategies. I said, look, Terry, it's a doubling on low G, followed by a Dre doubling, E and F on low A. So G, G, A, off. So you have a theme, doubling, doubling, off. Theme, doubling, doubling, off. Now, with 80% of the pupils I've worked with and helped them recondition their Crunluath, that works. With him, didn't work. He needed a rhythmic reference point. Words, an expression. So I remember I was pulling my hair out trying to find another way of getting it through to him on this. And then I heard this raspy Edna voice in my ear saying, tell him the bumblebee line. So I said, Terry, I'm going to try something that Ed and I used to use. And it was crazy. Ed had some crazy teaching ideas that worked because he was a great teacher. So let's say the low A is the word I with a G grace note, I. Then the two low G's are M-A. And then the two low A's are bumble. And then off to the E, E, B. I am a bumblebee. And then kind of build it up from there. But even when it's done quickly, I am a bumblebee, you hear the articulation of the actual expression. Well, day one, they worked. They absolutely worked. I tell you just a fun story. He said to me at one point in time, and Jim, you may have been there when this actually happened. We had finished judging at the Virginia Tattoo Contest, and we were outside the little round tables, little bar tables, and we're having a refreshment, as one does at that point at the end of the day. And I knew that Terry's daughter was going to be there that weekend. He said, oh, she plays with Ottawa Police. I said, oh, yeah, I didn't know your daughter's a piper. He said, no. And I said, tenor drummer. He said, tenor drummer. So this very bubbly 30-something woman came running over. Judges were all there, and she said, hi, you don't know me. She said, of course the judges are going, what's going on? And then she said, I am a bumblebee. And I went, oh, you're Erin, Terry's daughter. Yes. Anyway, they were just on a cruise recently, and she grabbed his phone, the parents and Erin and her fiance, and she took a picture of Terry and his wife dancing. And his wife is also a tenor drummer too. So she said, I thought you'd like to see a picture of a smiling tenor drummer and a bumblebee tripping the light. Fantastic. Anyway, I digress. But an expression, putting words to something, is what might work for someone, might work for you, breaking it down. And let me give you another one. You hear in a number of our light music tunes, and I know a lot of people struggle with the movement. We call it the bubbly note. In the Cantoric, it's actually called a derido. And you go down to low G, and then it's a D grace note, a C grace note, and off. Now, we learned GD, we learned GF, we learned GE, but we never, when we were learning doublings, learned a DC. And that's what That's what it is. And of course, that's such a key movement in the third part of Susan MacLeod, which messes soloists up and messes bands up when they want to play Susan MacLeod, as people struggle with the movement. And it's interesting going down to the low G, doubling off, and da da da, and da da da. And the first low G is an and note. Putting the word and on something quite often helps our technique. And when you point out to someone that's still struggling, I said, how do you make an E doubling? G, F, right? This one is on low G. It's a D and a C. Same two fingers on the opposing hands. When you point that out, go, boom, light switch goes on. So there was this block, this mental block, because they'd never played that doubling. If you're working with youngsters beginning right now and you're starting to work on doublings, add that one to the mix. Not just GDs, GE, GF, double G. How about DC, DC, DC? Because then when they hit that movement, they've been playing it. Another one that people have trouble with is the B grace note, either in we call it a Rodin movement, which is, and that is brutal for so many people. But they eventually get it, but then you get a Turluth on D, and it's actually made with a B grace note, not a D grace note. And of course, people question me. They say, why? I said, well, because I think some McCrimmon back in the 1600s was very sadistic and came up with the B grace note for the D Turluth, because your fingers just want to play a D. However, if you have a D theme and then to come back with a D grace note, maybe that's the reason. But it's really a Rodin movement with an E grace note at the end. So you'll get players who are good with that movement. I said, just stick an E grace note at the end. And when you mention that and you get them to try it that way, do a few Rodin movements, stick an E grace note on at the end, they go, that's the best D Turluth I've ever played. So we have these mental blocks, and you hear it with players if they're playing a variation with D themes in a pibroch, and all these Turluths are wonderful, and the thematic treatment's beautiful, and then they hit the D one, and they're so worried about this, they don't have enough D theme, and then they open the movement wide open, and you hear a-dub-a-dum versus ha-dub-a-dum. Anyway, that's a strategy to use on that one. I mentioned finger elevation, and I've got in my own notes here, and these are movements so many people, all of us at some point in time, struggle with. The Worrall movement itself. Now, whether you're making a good old-fashioned number 7 Worrall, or tap pull, or even, and if the arthritis kicks in on my pinky, I'm fully prepared to do a double tap or a tap pull, although I've done the number 7 my entire life. But I get people going into the Worrall, and I know there's the issue with the B finger moving, and because the tendons are connected between the pinky and the B finger. And you have to, as you finish the movement, that B finger and my seat, as I finish the movement, watch my hands here go boom, and I pull down. But at the same time, I'm pushing in with the thumb at the back. So there's a full kind of clamp grip. So there is going to be No movement. I won't allow movement of that B finger as I play the burl, whether it's a 7 or a tap pull, whatever way I'm choosing to make the movement. But people having trouble with the movement, they're missing the hole when they start the movement, but they're starting with the pinky way up in the air, and it's, hold on, just bring it down, bring it down, bring it down. In fact, people that are doing a number 7 burl, I said, put your finger on the chanter but above the hole. And now do the swipe down and the swipe back on the chanter, down and back. And I realize if I'm finishing a 2/4 march like dum-ba-dum, and as soon as I go to the low A, da-da-dum, and I drop the pinky, it's on the chanter, it's above the hole, and I get the burl. And I don't miss it. And a pupil plays in the Open Professional, really musical, really good player, good ear, etc. Burl was the problem. And even when he would nail them, they would be technically really good. They were coming in after the beat or at the back end of the beat. Why? Because his pinky was too high in the air. He had all this geography to make up. And consequently, the burl was coming in late. Okay. So finger elevation has a lot to do with it. Pupil at the house today, and I asked him, I won't mention his name, I said, can I use you as an example tonight? He said, go for it. His takums were very indistinct. And he was playing Donald McLeod composition, Mrs. Duncan McFadgen. So the takums were, and I'm looking at his fingers. I said, first off, you're jamming it. But the C fingers were that high off the chanter. I said, could you give me a little and datum and datum? And the B needs to be defined. Ho, di, and datum, three, and datum, three, and datum. It started to come with more elevation on his 2 C fingers. And I said, but I'm looking at your pinky. And there's the old thing about open C's, closed C's. There's an open C. I remember the late John Wilson, who taught me, said he, at some point in the 1950s to 1960 thereabouts, he used to play with open C's all the time, but the pitch of the chanter started to rise, and you could really hear the difference between that and that. So he relearned his C's to always close them. So anyway, this pupil of mine was not playing open C's, but when he played the C on the takum, it was like the pinky was asleep. It would just barely touch the chanter. So here comes the tactile part of what we do. You know, some people say, oh, you always have to play with light hands. I went, not all the time. There's a time to feel the chanter. Hum, batro, tri, and there's a time to elevate. Ken Eller used to say, oh, you're a high executionist, so you're keeping your technique as you get older. And I said, I'm a high executionist where it needs to be high, and I keep the fingers close where it needs to be close. Hum, batro, tri, and so there's a B, not there, and datum, to get the and note. And now here's the tactile, datum and datum. So I said to my pupil, do a few in slow motion, and I want you to feel the chanter with the C. Focus, put your mental focus on the pinky and closing the C's in your takums. I want to see the action. I want to see the rhythm in your hands, because I wasn't seeing. I was just seeing this very soft bottom hand stuff. Not enough elevation on key notes, theme notes, and not enough definition with the appropriate fingers to define the note. Well, he started to do this, and he played 3 or 4 in a row, which are really good. He stopped and he said, I could hear it. I said, right, because you could feel it. You could feel it. So the whole thing there is, this is the tactile thing I want to address tonight. What fingers define the note? If you're playing a tockum from short E and let's say a dotted F, now that 4-note sequence, dot, cut, cut, dot, the 2 middle notes have the same mathematical value on the manuscript, but that's not the music. We need to give number 2, tra and datum, ha and datum, not ha and datum. So how do we get that? So the F is our lead-off note. Number 2 note is an E. Oh. When you point this out to people and say, look, your 2 E fingers are already off the chanter. So what finger do we need to zero in on mentally and focus on to define that E, to give us a little more and value? Ah, and datum. The F finger, F finger. Sometimes people think, oh, my tockums are bad. I said, no, see that note before, that F, the E rather, coming from F, that's the bad one. Now, if you define that, I bet your tockum's going to get a lot better. And invariably, it does. And couple that with ha, and here comes the tockum. Define the C. Focus on the pinky. There's a great 2/4 march written by Ronnie Laurie called the Glenfinnan Highland Gathering. There's from Jack. Do you have any recommendations for moving from being able to play an embellishment clearly, cleanly? I didn't see the rest of that message. Just a second, I'll check it. In isolation to being able to integrate it into a tune or melody. That's a really good question. If someone, we talked about the turlo at the outset, if someone's not defining the rhythm in the movement, and they start going da da dum, and I go no. If it's a 4/4 march, it's ha da da da, ha da da da. So play it within the context of the time signature, so that when you integrate it into the tune, it's going to make sense. Because if you're just playing it isolated, going, it's not going to make sense when you need to go. And the same thing if it's an embellishment in like a 6/8 time. So integrate it into using the actual time signature you're going to be playing it in. So that'd be my advice there. And also keeping the tempo down initially till you get comfortable articulating the movement correctly and in the time signature that you're playing in the actual tune. Got a bunch of others I want to throw out at you here, because I'm thought if I just kind of have the skipping stones and go whoosh, whoosh, just keep throwing them here, some of you might be sitting and saying, oh, I don't have a problem with that. I don't have a problem with that. And all of a sudden go, that's my issue. I'm hoping that I have at least one thing that will help everyone, but it might be a different thing. Okay. So finishing tockums with that pinky. I'll go back to the Glenfinnan Highland Gathering. That da-da-da-da rhythm that we get in 2/4 marches, and the more complicated 2/4 marches have loads of those. It starts. There's one right off the bat. D and da-da, throw in bar 2. 1, 2, 3, 4. Number 2 note is a D. Now, if you don't lift your fingers high enough on that D, and if you don't think about the pinky on the D, you get, and it's a mishmash, rhythmically and musically. As you get into the second part, there are a couple more. And then you get to the third part. Okay, 2 bars and we've already got 3. Hum batati dum batati dadi dadi tro. 4 bars, we've got 5. Hum batati dum batati dum batati para. We got 8. 8 in that part times 2, 16. 16 of those. So 16 beats are 16 beats. How many beats are there in a part? Okay, so you start seeing the majority of that part is that rhythm. The first one, hum, yan, dadi, defining the C with that D grace note. Thinking of the pinky, hum, yan, dadi, and there's a D, that's a lift. Hum, andadi, 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 bri. So when you get those and define the number 2 note, lifting, feeling the chanter, watch it come to life. The tricky ones where it take place when it's the second half of a beat and the first half of the next beat. So in the last part you get, now after that grip, which ends in the offbeat, I'm on high A. He, patra, and datum. So it's a and datum. And we hear straight through the rhythm in there. Lifting the D. So I would have my foot in the air and go a and datum, e and datum, e and datum, and feeling the chanter with the D fingers off and the pinky on the chanter before the talcum. Those are the tough ones. And if you take a look at those rhythmically demanding sequences, those 4-note sequences, and highlight them in the tune, you might find that there's a limited number of different ones throughout the Glenfinnan Highland Gathering. And you could number them. You could put them on a piece of manuscript paper and just practice those. In terms of exercises, I was never one for playing loads of exercises like from exercise sheets or anything like that. I wasn't taught that way. Maybe I should have been, but what I was taught to do is find the difficult bits so that those 4-note sequences, how many keep getting repeated. You might find you have 4, 5, 6 different ones throughout the tune. Well, then just do a whole practice session just on those sequences. At the tempo that you're playing the tune, set it with the metronome, play them to the metronome, and watch it come together. I want to talk about D throws a little bit. If you're playing the soft D throw, and where you're going to C, but a D grace note takes you there. Here's what I hear a lot. And it's more a tap, not a grace note. So when you're playing your D throws, a soft one in particular, I want you to think about the D grace note to C. Not now let's take a look at its opposing or parallel embellishment. I know the tutor books call it a double high G. I don't know why. I call it a high G throw. And So the high G throw, quite often you hear people playing more like a tap, like a strike. That's common. That is so common. Think of it, and that's why this double high G thing rears its head, the terminology, and I like the high G throw. You got the D throw, the high G throw, and look at this, folks. The high G throw is made with the G grace note. The soft D throw is made with the D grace note, same grace note, opposing hands. Rhythmically, hopefully, the way I'm playing those, you can hear that they're totally parallel. Tonally, they're different because they're going to different notes, and they're made with two different grace notes, but it's the same grace note on opposing hands. Okay, so that's why I keep calling it the high G throw. And that's a problem for a lot of people. Hopefully that helps you at least think about it. Strikes on the chanter, whether you're playing a one-fingered strike or the full one, getting the rhythm right. When the full closure D strike, in slow motion, I don't want to hear where you get the two C fingers, or maybe just the C finger itself, and then you get a drag off to the D finger. So they have to be departing the chanter unified, hitting it unified, departing it unified. I teach it, the full one, like a G off, and then shortly after that, the G gets shorter. But you don't want to hear that drag. So getting these kind of digital drags, either in a D strike, how about going to F from a bottom hand note? I hear this in the open professional, where you get, instead of, you hear, I don't know if you hear that, just a tiny bit of an imprecision where the E finger comes off fractionally ahead of the F finger. They need to come off in unison. Now, that's tough to do. So where do we put the mental focus? Zone in on the F finger, because that's the one that defines the pitch of that note, and make sure that it's lifting. It's taking the lead. So I said, when people are going up to like an F or even a high G, no, you don't want to hear a drag. So make sure that the high G finger is driving the bus there. F. So those imprecisions are huge problems for a lot of players. And gracing imprecisions. Pupil that was here this afternoon, one of her issues is going to a D doubling from a short note, like, and her D fingers lift and the G finger comes up a little late. So you hear, there, I'm trying to duplicate it, something like that, versus, so the G finger drives the bus. This is the one thing that a lot of things are tutor books, because they condense learning into quick, easy steps. But they don't necessarily give us the full picture. They'll say, as you go from one note to another, you need to do it cleanly. You don't want to have this and this and this happen. However, if they showed us, like, as you go from E to D with a G grace note, picture one. Okay, there's our E. Here comes the D, which is this, with a G grace note, which is that. So as these fingers are coming down, 3 come up, 4th one comes up, and there's a fraction of a second where your F fingers on the, it looks like a bunny rabbit, the F fingers on the chanter, thumbs on the chanter, And the only other thing that's on the chanter is your brace thumb at the back. So if you videotaped your hands and then played it back in slow motion, you would see a fraction of a second where it's like that. So what we really need in tutor books is picture 1, picture 2, and you could have the fingers with arrows pointing up, arrows pointing down, and it's like coming up, and then the 2 E fingers along with the G grace note fingers, we're going home, boom, and then it's clean. And then you can work on the whole doubling. But imprecise grace note placement is a huge problem for a lot of players. And it might not be that one. It could be an E doubling from F, and you hear a little fractional E before the G grace note. But as you're on F, you're going to E with the G grace note, lift 1, drop 2. Lift 1, drop 2. Easy to say that in a tutor book. Here's at one of the spots, and I'll give you another strategy on this, because sometimes when you're going from one note to another and you'll be dealing with it in a tune you've never had before. And you hit a roadblock and you go, fingers don't want to do it. So the first tune I teach, Scots Wahey. Te shando shando handra. And then you get to the end. Here it comes. And they look at the music, and we're going from E to D with the G grace note, and you see the player stall, and they're going, how do I do it? How do I do it? They haven't done it before. Remember I talked a few minutes ago about, do we go to the starting point or the end point? Let's go to the end point. What's the end point? G grace note on D. So I said, stop. Just go to D and play a bunch of G grace notes. Now I'll go back to E and go to D with the G grace note. Any of the beginners I've worked with, I've never had that fail. It works every single time. So there's a little strategy. If you're having trouble going from one note to another and getting it clean, go to the end point and the grace note. Okay? And just go to the end point and play it. Whatever the grace note is, whatever that end point, that final note is, and then go from the short note to it. You know, I hear players who've been playing for a long time in street bands, they've never competed or anything like that, and they're Scott and the Brave instead of is. I go, hold on, I'm hearing a little low A before the G grace note. Versus lift 1, drop 2. So have them go to the end point. And they fix it. So simple strategies like that, they truly work. Crossing noises, it plagues so many of us. And the classics are E, C to E, D to E, going bottom hand to top hand. But you also get it going from the top hand to another top hand note. This one, 2 fingers are coming down, 2 more come up, and the 2 fingers drop. But if the 2 fingers touch before these lift, you get a little low G. Or if the pinky comes up and then the E's late, you get a low A. Here's the low A crossing noise. Clunk. There's the low G one. There's a clean one. Okay? Same with crossing noises. The top hand ones, as you're going from E to high A, you don't want to hear. No. I used to simply call that a catch, not a crossing noise. regardless, you're going, crossing noises I always thought was from the bottom hand to the top hand, or back and forth, whereas a catch was all on one hand. But E to high A is one that happens a lot, where the E finger touches and then the rest of the high A fingers come up, versus the E fingers coming down, and there's a point where the whole top hand's off very briefly, and then the E finger touches. Versus so many of these are like epidemic, and you might not have bottom hand to top hand crossing noises or vice versa, but you might have catches on your top hand or your bottom hand. So isolating what's really happening with your fingers as you go from one note to the other. Which fingers are coming off as the others are getting ready to come on, but they haven't quite come on yet. Right. If you're working on like the triple shakes we get in our hornpipes these days, which is a doubling, but in case it's not a GD, which is normally a B doubling, it's a GE and then a strike, da da da, 1 2 3. If we used a rhythmic reference point on that, GDE, so you could do those back and forth to get those, all of those balanced. So balancing those triple shakes. And then along come some of the contemporary composers like Gordon Duncan, Alan MacDonald, and they think it's really clever to challenge us with one on. And I remember as a kid learning these hornpipes with, I thought I was clever at mastering those. And then all of a sudden new tunes come out with, and I struggle with it because I didn't learn it when I learned the others. So if you're working with any students right now and teaching those movements, teach up the scale, these triple shakes on every single note, because they're going to ultimately encounter tunes with it in. The same thing with the high A strikes. We learned either down or up or just a tap. And I did learn to either swipe down or swipe up. And I remember I did write a jig which has hum ba da da, but I can't do the swivel. The late Donald MacLeod, he did the swivel and he could play like a burl, da 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 da. So when you're teaching a student the strike from the get-go, teach them the swivel. Now, you're going to hate them because they're going to be able to come back and go da-ba-da, da-ba-da, or da-ba-da, da-ba-da. They have the flexibility in their fingers when they're young to do that. Those of us at this seasoned age can't have that kind of flexibility. So they'll do it just to taunt you. And but it behooves us to teach them what they're going to encounter in some of these contemporary compositions. Now just let me have a quick look here. Finger elevation I talked about. Yeah, and I talked about finger tension. There's a time for that tension, or maybe we'd call that the kind of the physical part of what we do with our hands on the chanter. This comes back to, are you an auditory learner, are you a visual learner, or are you a kinesthetic learner? And I think we think so much of what a percussionist would do falls under the kinesthetic domain, and I would agree with that. But the kinesthetic, the percussionist is also dealing with the visual side of it and the auditory side of it, but they're much better with, of course, it's that touch thing. And with Cliff with us tonight, I know on a bass drum, that kinesthetic side, to get that right tonality out of an instrument that you're playing requires that touch. There's a time to be soft. There's a time to dig in and create a little more depth out of that note that you're producing on the instrument. Well, the same thing for us as pipers. There's a time to dig in a little more. So if you're playing a crunluath or a turluath and you're coming in with the D grace note too soon, it means that you're not feeling the kinesthetic side of this thing. You're not feeling the chanter with the pinky enough before the D grace note is given permission to do its thing. All of those movements. So there's a time for the touch and the feel on it. And you look at and listen to some of these legends who are still playing brilliantly into their 60s and beyond. Watch their hands, and you'll see them doing it. There'll be times when they elevate a little more. There'll be times where you see them just digging in a little bit. The whole light-fingered approach all the time. I know many people were taught to have a light touch all the time. My concern there is you're going to potentially lack a lot of rhythm and accuracy in embellishments, and it might work when you're younger. As you get older, you need some other strategies. A few other little random things that I've got in here, because I've talked about a lot of different movements. F doublings. As I've got older, the F doubling is not my friend. Okay, so I have to really focus on keeping my top hand loose on the because I can get these staggery F doublings that they're not good. It's a problem for a lot of people, F doublings. So it's that looseness. So you might be able to take a C doubling going. So I'm really hard with the gracing on my C doubling, like. But anaphylcomers, they have to have a lighter touch to them, because otherwise it's da-da and da-da and da-da, and you lose the idiom, you lose the Strathspey idiom. Many pipers would describe their big Achilles heel technically, short Fs to E doublings. So you're coming down from high A, let's say, to F. The two pinch fingers define the F. And then you're going to, from F to an E with a G grace note. If you come down with tension when you define the F, here's what you get. Ha and da-da. So you get the stagger. It's like a stutter. So you have to be really light with that closing for the F before you go to the E doubling. The terminology I use on that one, and even the doubling itself, is feather it. You have to feather it because if you're too hard with the execution on it, you're going to lose the rhythm of ha, patra, patra, tarambre, and tarantro. So that's a huge, huge problem for many, many pipers. And I've seen pipers who are so musical. Their technique is wonderful. They've got a great ear. You're just ticking off all the boxes, and they could go all the way in the open professional, and they have a problem with that movement, the short F into E doublings. So you have to make it differently. If I'm going, from low A, a short low A, into an E doubling, I'm harder with my fingers. But even there, you probably can hear a slight difference in the execution or the quality of the E doubling. It's more open. So it has to be done very, very differently in terms of feathering the movement. And that's where too much finger tension coming down is your enemy. So time for tension on the chanter, time for a lighter touch. What have we missed? Grace and accuracy. We've talked about crossing noises, the strikes, the dare. We haven't talked about maybe some other pibroch movements. The dare movement, in the way it's written, you see the F as a grace note, but it's really, let's say we're coming from high A. We have to define the F and then an E grace note off. So I talk about the movement being F down, grace note off. F down, grace note off, not don't jam it to try. So I'm getting a little more F there than you might think in terms of a grace note. So F down, grace note off. So you hear a very well-defined F there. People have trouble with that movement because they lose the E before the grace note. So you hear F and then you hear a grace note down to E. In other words, you had one E and then off. That's only part of the movement. Aha. F down, then the grace note off. Defining the full rhythm to the movement. Okay. I'll jump back to even the rhythmic reference points. Strathspey playing. Bread and butter. All those doubling cuts. And of course, one of the standard exercises, and it's a brilliant one because it gives you a rhythmic reference point for the okay, so the GDEs played as a strathspey, not da da da, it's tapata, tapata, so we're accenting to the third note, but we get add all sorts of exercises you can put together there. If you're fine with a because if your teacher is telling you, or on a score sheet, you've been told that you need to snap more on your doubling cuts because you're going versus versus okay. Just trying to think of some other examples. You know, one of the standard little two-parted strathspeys a lot of our bands will play in a medley would be Molly Connell. There's an interesting thing. Dot, cut, cut, dot. And dot, dot. So I'm giving a little more E with those top three fingers. So there's a setup note to that run. And there at the end of the part, I want to hear a B doubling. I don't want to hear What happened there? I didn't play enough C. C, pinky. If you get a well-defined C, you'll get a da-da-do. If you don't have a well-defined C, you'll get da-ba-da-dee-do, and there's no articulation to the doubling. Okay, so those are few strategies there just on the first part of Molly Connell, addressing all the individual things: finger elevation, the touch to finish the C's, tri and dapato, and these setup notes, and there's the tension on the chanter before the 3-note run. That kind of, it reinforces all of the things I've been talking about this evening. How are we doing, Jim? How are we doing for time?
Sorry, I was muted. Whenever you're done, we're an hour and 10 minutes.
Yeah, so I'm just looking at my notes. I wanted to talk about grips, Tourlouis, Kernlouis, Dre movements, Edry movements, Steridol movements, Burls, D throws, high G throws, doublings and 3-note runs and strathspeys, talked about F doubling issue, E doublings from a short F, D doublings from a short E, Burls, the soft D throw versus the high G throw and getting them balanced, not being a strike. The rodent movement with the B grace note and consequently the D Tourlouis. Strikes. And quite often the strike, if you really look at the strike and the rhythm, even like in a jig, ada, it's like a doubling. You don't want jammed. Now to get those E's, I'm really pulling my finger off versus jamming it. So little things like that where the finger elevation will get the 2 strikes balanced. Gracing accuracy, we've talked about. The grace note takes you to the note. This is an interesting thing. People will question this and say, oh, where does the beat fall? On the note, on the theme note. And this is a never-ending debate amongst many pipers. And some people say, well, it happens at the start of the doubling. And I said, no, the doubling takes you to the note. The burl takes you to a theme note. Brum. The Tourlouis, dum-a-dum, dum-a-dum. It takes you to a theme note. So it's where that note is. That's where the beat falls. Some people will think that it starts at the beginning of the movement, and then you're hearing this slightly erratic playing, and it's impacting their music. But all I can say is, look, if you look at manuscript paper and where these grace notes and everything are, they're written before the note, not on top of the note. They're written before because it takes you to the note. E grace note finishes the Tourlouis on the beat. The D grace note, etc. And then you can start talking about offbeats too, but it's getting that accurate placement of the grace note. It takes you to the note. We've talked about crossing noises and catches. We've talked about where you put your mental focus. We've talked about what finger or fingers are actually executing the note, and sometimes putting a focus on the fingers executing the note, such as the pinky for a C and a tocum. The correct amount of finger tension. There's a time for a little more. There's a time to let it relax, such as short F's to E doublings, finger elevation, and a mental approach to grace notes and some appropriate exercises. Maybe just finish with that mental approach to grace notes. You look at most of our jigs and they're written pretty even. I could go very even, or I could go mental approach to the grace note. What I'm doing there is I'm not putting a dot on that first low A, but I'm lifting the grace note, shup-bum. So the G grace note is like that, and the D's like that, and the E's like that. Yup-a-dum, 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 yup-a-dum. I was with a group just a few weeks ago. It's a grade 4 band, and we had to do some exercises on that in the little jig that they got going in their medley. And it was dramatic. It was absolutely dramatic, the change it made. And I said, just think about the finger going yup-a-dum, 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 yup-a-dum. And that sorted it for them. So they put a focus then on the lead-off grace note, shup-a-dum, and not playing them all the same, dum-bum-bum, dum-bum-bum-bum-dum, and then it's totally even, and there's no music. So how do you get that subtlety in a jig without going dum-ba-dum, bum-ba-dum, yup-a-dum, 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 yup-a-dum? So that's kind of a different mental approach to the actual grace notes. So all grace notes are not created equal. And even all doublings are not created equal. The late John McClellan said, the most important doubling is the doubling in bar 8 of a 2/4 march. So instead of and da-da, oh, to really fatten up the rhythm in that doubling in bar 8 of each part. So I thought that was a really interesting comment. I still remember him telling me that. He said I was doing it correctly, but I really wasn't thinking about it. So he got me thinking about analyzing what I was doing, which he liked. He says, I like how you're opening up those doublings in bar 8. It's the most important doubling in a 2/4 march. Had never thought of it that way before. Have we missed anything in terms of technique that we could have covered tonight?
Paul, you have a question? Go ahead.
You'll have to just unmute yourself, Paul. There we go.
Sorry about that. Yeah, Hey, good to meet you. I was wondering if you could just go back for a second. I hate to make you go back, but you were talking about the G throws,
Mm-hmm.
and did you say that was the same thing as a G doubling, or no? Is that another
No.
name?
Yeah, well, the high G throw, the tutor books call it a double G, but I call it a high G throw because it's a grace note and off. The D throw is the soft one is a D grace note to C and off. Now, I was taught the heavy one, G, G, C off, and I play that one in my light music except from low G. I always play the soft one from low G, and in P-Rock and slow airs, I always play in light music. I play the heavy one. Either's
Yeah,
correct.
I might have misspoke. There was the G throw though, is what you were talking about,
Yeah, the
and
high G throw.
yes, sir.
Yeah,
Um, So, in my experience, which is limited, the doublings have been, two consecutive sharp pulses. Bop, 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 bop.
yep.
When you play the G doubling, it's the same, or is it more of a throw kind of feel?
More of a throw kind of a feel, and that's why it's a G grace note on F and then off. And by using that terminology, the high G throw versus double high G. Double high G runs the risk. Some people actually say, oh, I thought it was like a G, and then I would tap and I get a second high G. So that's why they're tapping. And fair enough, I can see why they would interpret the tutor book that way. However, it's not a tap, it's a grace note. So
Well,
a
I'm glad
grace
I
note to
asked.
F.
That's exactly what I thought it was. I
Yep,
thought, and I started telling other guys, like, pretty sure it's supposed to be just like the doublings, but no, I appreciate hearing that
it's a
it
G.
is
It's
a
a G
different
grace
sound.
note. And you know what? I'm glad you brought it back and that we revisited that because it's epidemic. It's epidemic in piping where people play that high G throw more as a tap, a strike, versus a grace note and off. There's cabaret. Now, if I played a tap, kind of clunky sounding, right?
Hmm.
And you hear that so often. Okay,
Thank you.
no problem. Other things to revisit, or
Any
I guess
questions or any comments, any revisits? You didn't cover seven stroke rolls, Bob. I was
I
kind
know. Can we do that for our session next year?
of, we can.
Rob, can I just say thank you so much for loving piping and the piping world and everything as much as you do because you have kept me interested for since 1976 or so. So,
Oh
I
my God.
mean, I've always played in bands, and sometimes you lose your solo ability when you play in a band for a long time. So, I try to keep my technique where I try to learn a new tune. I feel like that's the only refreshing way to
Yep.
listen to my techniques. So, but you are just such an enthusiast, and I thank you so much for that.
Oh, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. You know, if I can just go back to Paul's question on the high G throw, and that and to get that lovely G grace note and off. Um, I wrote a tune yesterday. It doesn't happen very often. The spirit has to move me. There has to be an inspiration. So all of a sudden it happens yesterday, and it's got right early in the first part some high G throws. And as I was playing it, and I did record it on the computer, so I'd have it as a reference, I realized I was just a bit tense with my high G throws in terms of that grace note and off. And so today I went over it. This is a tune like I've written the tune, but I'm using my own strategies on the high G throw to just soften that up to get the touch I wanted. And it needed a few reps to get these old fingers doing what I wanted them to do, but I got there. So truly, I practice what I preach in this. And I think for me, doing a session like this to now is probably better for me that if Jim had said back in 1976, oh, could you do a session for us on technical clues and this and that, whatever, and I'm going, you know, at my age at that point, the fingers would they just do what I wanted them to do. Well, they don't necessarily do what I want them to do now, and I have to come up with strategies that work for me, and quite often they're the strategies I will use with pupils to keep my own playing clean and accurate. And the other thing, I guess I could have stated this earlier. I've heard people say, or they'll describe a player, say, oh, so-and-so's they're quite a technical player, but they're not that musical. And I went, or someone's they're very musical. They got the technical issues, but oh my God, they're musical. And I went, no, I'm sorry. You know, you can't separate those two things. To have good music, you need to have good technique. And I will with pupils, because I know this came up probably earlier with Jack's question, is that I will show them a strategy where they've got a technical issue that's going on. I said, no, hold on. We have to play it within the idiom. And whether it's a 6/8 march or whatever, to get the feel of that tourlueth in a 6/8 march, or get the feel of those doubling cuts in the strathspey, so it's not da da dum, it's shipadum. Get that snap. And so I don't think you can separate, good music and good technique. If someone's a really musical player, they probably have some really great technique, which is showcasing their music. And if someone's having some technical issues, it's probably impacting their music. Give you a quick example of a young lad that I'm teaching who competed recently for the first time in the pipes in his grade 5 event, 2-part march. And he played High Road to Gairloch. And he came back for his lesson and he was over the moon. First time, and he hasn't been on pipes just a few weeks, and he was right in there. Because he said, "Oh, should I play in the practice chanter event?" It was a series of knockouts. I said, no, you're ready for the pipes. Let's go for it. Because he had done one event, practice chanter, and he won it. And I said, no, let's go on the pipes. And I know the issue that I was working on with him, but came back and he got second, and he was over the moon. And I said, "You have your score sheet?" Yeah. And what I was working on with him is he never misses a doubling. But his High Road to Gairloch was coming across this way. And I said, "Alex, you gotta close those doublings. Hold that note a little bit before. Dada ambarambe ipra dada ambra." Anyway, score sheet, and this kid, he's playing a reed that's probably stronger than mine. Like, he can blow a bagpipe. Lovely comment. Said, well delivered bagpipe, good steady blowing at this stage, very impressive. And then it said, very good tempo, confident delivery of the tune. Overall, very strong technique. One thing that's impacting your music a little bit, and there it was, your doublings need to be closed, of course. And he says, yeah, he told me about my doublings being too open. I said, well, there you go. But there's a case where if someone's coming on and going, dee, pa, three, and da, da, I go, hold on, whoa. It's one C that's embellished, so all of a sudden you're making a wide open doubling, which creates thematically 2 Cs. Or if he came in with dee, pa, three, and a jammed doubling where you lack the separation. So there's that sweet spot, da 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 versus da da. Anyway, so I have him for a lesson tomorrow evening, and we'll see where he's at as we move ahead.
Well, Bob, thank you very much for doing this. Really appreciate it.
It's been fun.
And for those of you on the Zoom here, this Sunday, just a reminder, is the entry deadline for the St. Louis contest. And a week from Saturday is the Ian Swinton Open in Park Ridge, where we got 11 terrific professional players that are playing light music and Pembroke. Bob will be in to judge, so you can ask him a question if you're there. Well, we hope to see you there. And then the season's off and running after that. So
the Swinton contest, you got me judging with some guy called Jack Lee.
Yep. Yeah, that's Terry's brother, in case you don't know.
I think I may have heard of him. Oh, it'd be good fun. It'd be great fun with Jack.
It will be. So thanks again, Bob, and thank you all for being on the call. And we'll see you next week, Bob.
Cheers.